Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of the Listening Room Sonic Journeys. I am your host, your groove guru, your guide to the vibes, the cultural DJ, and today's episode is about something that I've been thinking about recently that I actually decided to turn into an article or an essay to publish rather, as well as something I might use for a future zine topic. But that is the word timeless classic, or the phrase timeless classic. You hear the word classic in reference to albums get thrown around quite a bit. So that's what the topic is going to be on this episode. And I've already kind of written the article itself. So I'll read the first paragraph to kind of set the stage for what we're going to be talking about, and then I'll be off to the races. So the word classic seems to get thrown around quite a bit in reference to albums this day and age. When a new LP releases to immense critical acclaim, Instant Classic is among the first name tags slapped onto it, despite only having just came out and the audience having hardly any time to fully consume what it is that they've heard. Then there are records that have stood the test of time, that months, years, even decades later are still revered as among the best records ever conceived. But what exactly solidifies a classic in the minds of the public? So that's kind of what we're dealing with today on this episode. And I have three means of the solidification of a classic or a timeless classic. And the first way is the context of the album and the story behind the making of the album. And I feel that probably the best example of this is Marvin Gaye's 1971 seminal record, What's Going On. So What's Going On was conceived out of an obligation of Marvin to tackle some of the issues going on in the world. And at this point in time, he was essentially the prince of Motown. Like, he was untouchable. He was like their top star, their top draw. So what Berry Gordy Jr., the president of Motown, wanted him to do was essentially continue in the same manner he had been going in, as far as making fluffy, love-filled, like just really sentimental pop songs, right? But again, Marvin felt it was his obligation to tackle issues that mattered to him, issues like the civil rights movement, like environmentalism, like the war in Vietnam. So essentially, Berry Gordy denied this. He denied all of it. He didn't want Marvin to pursue any of these artistic endeavors. So what Marvin did was he actually boycotted making records. He stopped making records temporarily until Berry Gordy Jr. acquiesced and allowed Marvin to make the record that he wanted to make. And as a result, we ended up getting one of the best albums of all time, right? It tackled all the issues previously mentioned. The production value was just amazing. The instrumentation was incredible. It was so forward-thinking, and it's worth saying that at this point in time, protest music was not new. There have been artists in folk, in rock, and even in soul music that were making protest music well before Marvin Gaye did. But Marvin Gaye's his level of introspection and thoughtfulness on this record stood out because, again, he was the prince of Motown. He was known for making love songs and the sentimental stuff. So nobody was expecting him to really take on all these serious topics like the war, like civil rights. It wasn't something that many Motown acts at the time. In fact, hardly any Motown acts were doing at the time. So when he did it, it set a whole new stage that actually influenced many Motown and other soul acts to come to kind of follow in those same footsteps. That's how he got a lot of what Stevie Wonder did later in the 70s with more introspective and protest adjacent music. So yeah, that's the first way. The second way in which I believe an album can achieve timeless classic status involves an album being ahead of its time. In other words, it laid either the foundation for what was to come in a future generation of music, or it utilized soundscapes, production methods, lyricism, or instrumentation, or a combination of all of them to craft a project that was, new and different. Now, more often than not, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on, but more often than not, many of the classics within this category don't typically get a whole lot of praise or recognition right off the bat. Some of them are even critically panned due to being so different or so out of the listener's wheelhouse. And usually it's only years later that the album receives recognition that it probably deserved when it first dropped. But I felt a good example of this was the Velvet Underground's debut album from 1967, The Velvet Underground and Nico, which utilized elements like avant-garde and really vivid and weird lyricism. Well, weird for the time. They were talking about topics that really no other artist was touching at that point in time. And the abrasive attitude of the album that would essentially forecast punk rock. In fact, a lot of people consider this album to be the very first punk album ever made. Retrospectively, it's more so considered a proto-punk album, if you want to call it that. But for many people, especially when it comes to tracks like I'm Waiting for the Man, is often regarded as the first punk rock album of all ever made, right? So there's that, and of course there's a story that has gone around for many decades that while the album did not sell extremely well at first, anybody that heard it ended up buying a guitar and starting a band. So there you have kind of the punk ethos there as well. Whether or not that's true, I am not certain. I wasn't there at the time, but that is a story that is circulated for many, many years, and I think it's a really cool story if it is true. So that would be the first example, because now, the Velvet Underground and Nico is regarded as not only a watershed album for 60s music or 60s rock in general, but also a foundational record for, like I said, punk rock, for indie rock, for experimental rock, for more weird and vivid and just really strange music. And it's personally one of my favorite albums of all time, but that's a story for another day. Now, I have another example for this particular means, and that would be Outkast's 1996 album, ATLiens. Now, when Outkast won the 1995 Source Awards Best New Group Award, they were booed. People were just vehemently booing them out of the stadium, out of the arena, wherever they were at, right? And this was in the midst, this was the height of the East Coast, West Coast feud. So everybody wanted either West Coast or East Coast to win something, and these guys were strictly from the South. They're from Atlanta, right? So a lot of the focus of that particular award show was centered around the feud between the East Coast and the West Coast, so much so that the awards themselves didn't really matter that much. You had people from each side coming on stage, accepting awards or giving speeches and dissing the other side or saying that they're great. And that was what everybody was kind of putting their attention to. But when Outkast came on, they were getting booed out the building. And Andre 3000, amidst all these boos, would utter the immortal phrase, "The South got something to say," and he absolutely meant it, because ATLiens is now regarded as one of the best albums of all time, both for hip-hop, for Southern rap, for overall music history. And it did so because it did so many things that were so futuristic and forward-thinking. It blended the Southern hip-hop style that was present at the time with all these other influences like dub reggae and gospel and funk, and it injected all these songs with like really heady and thoughtful lyricism, and it really in that way it set itself apart from not just its regional contemporaries in the East Coast and the West Coast, but also their own Southern peers, because there weren't a lot of Southern hip-hop artists or rappers that were doing what they were doing at that point in time. So that really made them stand out in a really special way. Now, you could make the argument that because Outkast won this Best New Group award and they were on stage in front of so many people, you could say that they were getting their flowers then and there. But the fact of the matter is that these were two young guys, new guys from the South that nobody really wanted to see win, right? That's why they got booed in the first place. And it was because of albums like ATLiens and their follow-up Aquemini and their albums to follow those ones. It was years later when they really came into their own as one of the best groups out there. And now they're regarded as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, hip-hop group of all time. But they weren't recognized as such then and there. So it took a handful of years for them to really reach that classification of being not only a timeless classic group, but also ATLiens, and by extension, Aquemini, being timeless classic albums. Now, the third and final way in which I believe an album is deemed a timeless classic is by its ability to meld the conventions found in records from previous generations with modern sensibilities. A record that has the ability to connect with an older audience just as much as the younger one is particularly special, as the broad appeal allows for stronger recognition from different perspectives based on age. And I truly believe that perhaps the best example of this particular means is Kendrick Lamar's album, his 2015 seminal album, To Pimp a Butterfly. Now, this album was so special at the time, and people recognized how special it was at the time, but the fact that we still talk about it to this day means so much more. In addition to this album just having amazing stories and bars for days, Kendrick was able to tap into George Clinton-esque funk from the 70s, neo-soul of the late 90s and early 2000s, free jazz that reminds you of like 1950s John Coltrane, and just the gritty, anxious gangster rap of the 90s. And this is all fused with live instrumentation and like a really clear through line of Black culture and heritage that stretches all the way to Africa. He's connecting African experience and heritage to the Black American heritage experience, and showing kind of a pan-Blackness. And it's so beautiful and it's so wonderful. And all of this with a stylistic air that just screams now. Like, this is the sound. And you've got an album that just really has transcended the confines of rap music and has just become one of the greatest albums ever made. And to this day, really, it's become a measuring stick for a lot of rappers and for a lot of rap albums as far as creativity and storytelling, production, musical authenticity. It's a measuring stick that a lot of artists since have pulled from and taken ideas from and have utilized those ideas to build something that will also likely stand the test of time the same way. Now, a side piece I wanted to touch on real quick, in addition to the second means of albums being ahead of their time and not really reaching the height of popularity right off the bat, is the title of cult classic status. And a cult classic, for those that don't know, it's a piece of media that typically finds favor with a smaller, more niche audience as opposed to a mainstream broad audience. It's worth saying that many cult classics do indeed become mainstream classics over time. For example, this is outside of music, but, well, I mean, not really, but Rocky Horror Picture Show is a film that started out as a cult classic that over time became a mainstream classic. And the key prefix to all of this whole argument in timeless classic is time, because an album, in my honest opinion, needs time to become a classic. It needs time and reflection. Especially, and I'm saying this especially because there are a lot of younger people that hear an album and don't even give it a few days or a week, and they're already referring to it as a classic. Some of them are listening to it and they don't even get through half the album and they're already calling it a classic. And the album might sound good at the time, but the fact of the matter is that an album, to become a timeless classic, needs time. That's how you measure a timeless classic, is because over the course of time, right? Over the course of time, then you recognize how important and seminal it really was. And I will leave you all off with that. Thank you all so much for listening. Be sure to tune in next Thursday for episode 3. Be sure to follow all the socials and also check out the published article that much of this episode is based off of. All of that will be linked in the description. And also be sure to check out the accompanying playlist for this episode, which will also be linked in the description. Thank you all again so much for listening, and I will see you all next time. This is the Cultural DJ, signing off.